These are the Unit 1 notes for biology. Our first unit is on homeostasis and cells. So we need to know, what is homeostasis? Homeostasis is the ability for an organism to maintain relatively stable internal conditions regardless of environmental pressures. So that means whatever conditions an organism needs internally, like inside of their body, homeostasis is gonna help maintain those certain conditions to help the organism live. So here's some examples of things that are kept at homeostasis in organisms. The concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide. If your oxygen isn't at homeostasis, that's when you start to, suffocate, right? You have to get enough oxygen to your cells. Same with carbon dioxide. That's a waste product. You have to get rid of the carbon dioxide. pH of about 7. So if the pH is too high, that means it's too basic. That is not good for cells and organisms. If it's too low, that's too acidic. That's not good either. The cells in an organism cannot continue their normal life functions if the pH is not around 7. So concentration of nutrients and waste. So they move nutrients into cells and waste out of cells in order to maintain homeostasis and keep everything healthy. Concentration of salts and electrolytes. Those are moved around just like nutrients and waste are. This is why, like, when you're dehydrated, a lot of times you drink like a electrolyte solution, something like Gatorade, Powerade, or saline. If you go to a hospital for dehydration, it's to help keep not just the water in homeostasis, but also the salts and electrolytes. And then, like I just mentioned, water needs to be at homeostasis. If water is not at homeostasis, if you don't have enough water, your cells are going to shrivel. If you have too much water, your cells could burst. You also have to maintain a stable body temperature. In humans, if your body temperature is too high, we call that hyperthermia or a fever. If your body temperature is too low, we call that hypothermia. And both of those we have to treat, right? Both of them can be pretty serious because we have to maintain our temperature right around a very small range. So what happens if things are not kept at homeostasis? The body is going to begin to respond in one of two different ways, depending on what thing is not at homeostasis. Most of the responses are going to be what we call negative feedback. Negative in this case does not mean bad. Negative is just the term for this type of feedback. Most responses are going to be negative feedback. For negative feedback, the body response is going to be the opposite of whatever change occurred, right? The body is going to attempt to reverse whatever change was detected, right? So if something's at homeostasis and then there's a change, negative feedback is going to do the opposite of whatever that change is to try to reverse it and get it back at homeostasis. The goal of negative feedback is to prevent sudden and severe changes in the body. They don't want things to change super drastically, right? They're trying, if they notice a change starting to happen, they do the opposite to try to bring it back down to where it should be. So here's some examples of things that are negative feedback. Hypothermia, or low body temperature. If you have hypothermia, that means your body is cold. It's too cold. As a response, your body wants to warm it back up. So you're going to shiver in order to warm up. Once your body is warm again, you're going to stop shivering, right? So negative feedback is trying to do the opposite of what the change was. So the change was the body gets cold. The opposite is warming it back up. When your body is warm, then that shivering, that response is going to stop. And the opposite, high body temperature or hyperthermia, is another example of negative feedback. When your body is too hot, you're going to start sweating, do the opposite in order to cool down. Sweat, when it evaporates from your skin, helps you to cool down. So once your body cools, then you're going to stop sweating. So again, negative feedback is going to do the opposite of what original change happened. So if the original change was the body is too hot, then negative feedback is going to make it cooler. Okay. And the key thing with negative feedback is that the cycle stops as soon as things are brought back to homeostasis. So here's that same example we just talked about in kind of picture form. So your body senses that you're either too hot or too cold. If you are too hot, and your temperature is going up, then your body's going to try to respond by bringing your body temperature back down, right? Once your body temperature is brought back to homeostasis, the shivering or the sweating is going to stop. So that was negative feedback, but some responses are also positive feedback. Positive feedback is a little different and it seems kind of strange. In positive feedback, the body is going to respond by increasing the initial change, right? So these are very extreme events. That's why there's not very many of them. In negative feedback, when we had a change, your body did the opposite to bring it back to homeostasis. But in positive feedback, when it notices that change, your body is going to continue that change and make it a very extreme response. As a result, your body is going to get further and further away from that homeostasis point when it's positive feedback. So let's look at some examples of these to see if we can get it to make sense. Childbirth is one example. So during childbirth, the uterine walls are going to stretch, which cause contractions. Hormones are released, which cause more stretching, right? So we have that initial response of stretching, then contractions, and then more stretching, and then contractions and more stretching over and over and over and over until the result is finally, the child being born. So again, a very extreme event. Another is lactation, right? As the child feeds, it stimulates more milk to be produced. So the child is going to feed more, which makes even more milk produced. So it's a bigger and bigger response as time goes on. Blood clotting is a good example of this. So platelets are something that float around in your blood that help signal when your blood should start clotting. So if you notice an injury, right, that's obviously something bad that happened. The platelets are going to release clotting factors. Those are going to attract more platelets, which are going to release more clotting factors and attract more platelets and more clotting factors over and over and over and over until that wound is healed. Right? So again, positive feedback, super extreme. It just perpetuates the change versus negative feedback where we're doing the opposite to stop the change. So here's a picture just of what happens, like we said, in childbirth. So we have that stretching, which releases hormones. Those hormones cause more stretching and more contractions and over until the child is actually born. All right, so the big idea about homeostasis and feedback loops is that organisms respond to stimuli with positive or negative feedback in order to keep internal conditions stable and able to sustain life. That internal stable conditions, that is what we call homeostasis. So they use positive or negative feedback, depending on the situation, in order to maintain homeostasis internally. All right, so let's talk about different types of cells and the different parts of cells. So there are 3 parts to the cell theory. The first thing is that every living organism is made of 1 or more cells, right? The bigger the organism, the more cells it has usually. And there are some organisms that are only 1 cell big. You are made of trillions of cells, whereas a bacteria is only 1 cell. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things. What that means, that's really wordy, but what that means is that cells are the smallest living thing, right? You cannot get smaller than a cell, and still call it living, right? Cells are the smallest living thing. And then all cells come from pre-existing cells. That basically means cells can't just spontaneously happen. We can't build a cell out of nothing. All cells that exist came from other cells, right? So you can't just spontaneously make one. They all come from other cells that were already there. So there are 2 main types of cells. Oh, wait, before we do that, let's talk about what things all cells have in common. Every single type of cell is going to have DNA. If it doesn't have DNA, it's not alive and it's not a cell. Every type of cell is going to have DNA. Every type of cell is going to have a cell membrane. The cell membrane is the part on the outside that creates like the barrier. It's like the outside part of a cell. It keeps everything inside, keeps the DNA inside. Every type of cell is going to have a cell membrane. And every type of cell is going to have ribosomes, which we'll talk about why those are important later in class, and cytoplasm. Ribosomes are what is like the machinery that's going to use the DNA. So the DNA isn't any good without ribosomes. And then the cytoplasm is like the jelly stuff inside of a cell. So every single cell is going to have that cell membrane on the outside filled with the jelly-like cytoplasm. All of them are going to have DNA, and they're all going to have ribosomes in order to use the DNA. The two main types of cells, the first type is prokaryotes. Those are very simple cells. Things like bacteria are prokaryotes. Prokaryotes have no nucleus. You will see in eukaryotes that they do have a nucleus. Prokaryotes do not. No nucleus. Their DNA is just going to float around in that jelly cytoplasm. Their DNA is going to be in a big circle. It's circular. It's one big loop of DNA. And prokaryotes do not have any organelles. So they don't have things like mitochondria. They don't have chloroplasts. They don't have ER or any of those other organelles that we're going to talk about. Okay. The way I remember prokaryotes is think of pro, like no. Prokaryotes, no nucleus, no organelles. Pro, no. The other type of cells are eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are more advanced cells. These are things like plants and animals. They have more parts to them. So plants and animals are both examples of eukaryotes. All eukaryotic cells are going to have four main parts. They're all going to have a cell membrane like we talked about. They're all going to have cytoplasm like we talked about. They're all going to have a nucleus. So the nucleus in a eukaryote is what's going to store and protect the DNA. That's different than a prokaryote where the DNA is just floating around. In a eukaryote, it has a specific place where it's going to be kept. And all eukaryotes are going to have organelles. Organelles just means little organs. Each organelle has like a specific job. It's like little machinery, right? Little factories inside of the cell that all do specific things. So here's a picture of those cells. You should be able to recognize them based on a picture. Okay, so a prokaryote, you can see, has the cell membrane, has these little dots, which are ribosomes, has this big, long DNA loop. But unlike the eukaryote has all these different organelles in it. The prokaryote does not. So the eukaryote has its DNA in the nucleus, has these other organelles. The prokaryote does not. So eukaryotic animals and plants, prokaryotic are things like bacteria. So here's some of the major organelles. We're not going to go over all of them, just the ones that are most important for what we're going to learn about. First one is the nucleus. Like we said, it stores and protects the DNA. The DNA does not leave the nucleus. The DNA is very important, so it stays in the nucleus all the time. Remember that for these organelles, these are things that are only in eukaryotes, not in prokaryotes. Another major organelle is the mitochondria. The mitochondria, its job is to create energy for the cell. It is the place where the cell gets all of its energy to do any sort of process it needs. Okay, that's why we call it the powerhouse, right? A powerhouse makes energy. That's the job of the mitochondria. Mitochondria is going to use sugar that we ultimately get from food. It's going to use that sugar in order to create that energy. So this is where that process of food into energy happens. We have something called the endoplasmic reticulum. This is on the outside of the nucleus. This is going to allow the cell to move around things like proteins. When it makes proteins and has to send them different places, the endoplasmic reticulum, or we call it the ER, is going to help with that. And there's two different types of ER. There's a rough ER that has little ribosomes attached. That's this one with all the dots. And there's the smooth ER. So the ribosome is not technically an organelle because bacteria do have ribosomes, right? So this is not technically an organelle, but it's still a super important cell part. So again, it's found in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. All cells have to have ribosomes because the job of a ribosome is to make proteins from the DNA instructions. Without a ribosome, that DNA doesn't really have a purpose. So all cells need to have ribosomes. Then we have chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are only found in plant cells. Okay, only in plant cells. The chloroplast is going to create sugar from sunlight. So this is how plants get their food. Right? The food for plants is made in the chloroplast. It's going to use that sunlight to make sugar. That sugar is going to go to the mitochondria to make the energy. So plants have both chloroplasts and mitochondria. Mitochondria makes the energy. The chloroplast makes the food. So again, here's kind of a picture of a cell. You're not going to need to know exactly where all of these organelles are located, but you'll get a reference sheet in class that you can use if you need to. And then you should just be aware of like what they are, kind of what they do, because we're going to talk about them throughout the year. All right, there are two different types of eukaryotic cells. We kind of mentioned both of them already. So there are plant cells. Plant cells have a cell wall for structure. This is unique to plant cells, right? The cell wall is going to be very nice and rigid, right? Kind of stiff. It makes the cells look square or rectangular. This is going to allow plants to grow taller. Without the structure of that cell wall, the plants would just be floppy, squishy little things. Cell wall allows for that vertical growth. Again, creates that square shape of the cells. Another unique thing to plant cells is they have a chloroplast. Chloroplasts are going to help to obtain food from sunlight. And they also have large vacuoles to store water and to store food. Plants can't move around to find water or move around to find more food. So when they get extra water or get extra food, they're going to store it in that vacuole. So they need much more storage space than other types of cells. And then we also have animal cells. Animal cells are going to have that flexible cell membrane. So we don't have those rigid cell walls like a plant does. Our cell membranes are very flexible, right? That's why like animals are squishy. Right? Eukaryotic cells have many smaller vacuoles. We still have things that we need to store, but those vacuoles are much smaller. If we need water, we can go and get water. Even like a lion can go and get water if it needs water. Plants can't do that. So we still have to store some things, but we don't need as much storage as a plant. And then there are some things that both plant and animal cells have. Both of them are going to have mitochondria, again, using food to make energy. Both of them are going to have a cell membrane. So plant cells have a cell wall on the outside and a cell membrane right inside of that. Animal cells only have the cell membrane. So here's a picture of a plant cell. You can see it's more square shaped. It has this really big vacuole. You can see this thick cell wall around the outside, and you can see these chloroplasts floating around. The animal cell is more round shape. It only has the cell membrane, no wall, no chloroplasts, and it only has little tiny vacuoles, not the giant ones like here, right? Just this little one. All right, so we talked about a little bit about cell energy, but why do cells need energy, right? What do they use that energy for? So all living things need energy in order to carry out life processes. For example, things like growing. In order for an organism to grow, it needs energy. It needs energy to build some of the molecules that it needs, right? To build new things, build new cells, or build new organs, right? Things like that. It also needs energy in order to transport molecules. So in order to move substances in and out of cells, some of those substances need energy in order to move, right? So all those types of life processes, and there's more, need energy. Ultimately, on Earth, all energy comes from the sun. Although for animals, we can't get it directly from the sun, but that's ultimately where it came from. So from the sun, the energy is going to go to a producer. A producer is something like a plant that can use that sun energy to create food, right? To create like glucose and sugar molecules. Then it's going to go to consumers, which are things like animals. So we get our energy from the things that we eat. Everything that we eat can be traced back to a plant, and then that energy can be traced back to the sun. For example, if we eat a hamburger, the beef came from a cow. Where did the cow get its energy? From the grass. Where did the grass get its energy? From the sun. So there's two big processes we're going to talk about. The first is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis changes that light energy from the sun into glucose. So it's that first step of getting the energy from the sun and changing it into something usable. So it's going to turn it into glucose, which is just another term for a type of sugar. This process is going to occur in the chloroplasts of plants. We've looked at the chloroplasts before. And there are three things that are required for photosynthesis to happen. A plant must have water, it must have carbon dioxide, and it must have light to do photosynthesis. It has to have all three of those things in order to create that sugar. if it has those three things, it's going to produce glucose, which is sugar, and it's going to produce oxygen. So it requires water, carbon dioxide, and light. It's going to produce glucose and oxygen. So here's a picture of that equation. So you can see we have carbon dioxide plus water. This arrow means like a change is happening, some sort of reaction is happening. And because the sun is above it, that means it's happening in the presence of light. So when these two things are in a chloroplast with light, then photosynthesis can produce sugar, which is glucose, and oxygen. Okay. So going forward, you don't need to know the chemical formula for this. You don't need to know all these C's, C's, and O's, things like that. You just need to know the words, right? You need to know that carbon and water goes in with light, and sugar and oxygen comes out. That's what's produced. Needs these things, produces these other things. And this is where it happens. It's going to happen in the chloroplast of a plant cell. So the other process is cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is going to take that glucose that ultimately came from photosynthesis and turn that into energy. Okay. Cellular respiration is going to occur in the mitochondria. Remember, both plants and animals have mitochondria. A lot of students think that just plants have chloroplasts and animals have mitochondria. That's not true. Plants need both, because without mitochondria, a plant wouldn't be able to get any energy. The plant still needs mitochondria to take the glucose from photosynthesis and turn it into energy. For animals, it's going to get the glucose from the food that it eats and turn that into energy. So this process of cellular respiration requires glucose and oxygen. The reason you have to breathe oxygen in is to support this process. That's what that oxygen is used for when you breathe it in. And then it's going to produce energy that we can use for those different life processes. It's going to produce water. That's why you pee out water sometimes. Well, hopefully multiple times a day. That a lot of that water comes from cellular respiration. And it's going to produce carbon dioxide. That's why we exhale carbon dioxide. It's a waste product from this. So it requires glucose from food, oxygen from breathing it in. It's going to produce energy that's used for life processes. It's going to produce water that we release as waste. And it's going to produce carbon dioxide that we exhale as waste. So again, here's that equation. Very similar to the photosynthesis one. Again, you just need to know what goes in and what goes out. So for cellular respiration, glucose, which is sugar, and oxygen goes in, and water, carbon dioxide, and energy comes out. And that's going to occur in the mitochondria of plants and animals. Mitochondria are these little like kidney bean shaped things. So these two processes are very closely related. The requirements, if you notice, the requirements for one process are the same as what's created for the other, right? The reactions are opposites of each other. Both of those processes are needed in order to obtain and use energy from the sun. So because the sun is the ultimate source of energy, we need both processes in order to get that energy, create it into food, and ultimately get a source of energy we can use in animals and in plants, right? So let's take a look at this diagram. So here's a chloroplast, right? That's where photosynthesis is going to happen. Photosynthesis is going to take in carbon dioxide. It's going to take in water, right? Those are going into the process, along with light energy is going into the process. As a result, the chloroplast is going to create glucose, right, which is sugar. It's going to produce oxygen. These two things, sugar and oxygen, glucose and oxygen, are going to go into the mitochondria. The mitochondria is going to use those two things to make energy. This chemical energy is what organisms use, right? And it's going to produce water and carbon dioxide. And then the cycle can go over again, right? That water and carbon dioxide is used for photosynthesis, the glucose and oxygen used for cell respiration. If you can remember one equation, you can remember the other equation, right? You just need to know which is which, what goes into one process, what comes out of another process. So those are the end of your notes for Unit 1. Please make sure to turn them in on Canvas and make sure you ask questions in class if you need anything.